All right, so today we get to learn about the Gospel of Matthew. Just a fun fact, Matthew appears, you may notice if you open your Bible, it goes Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. However, Matthew was not written first. It was for a long time thought to have been written first, but more evidence clearly shows that it was not, and so it's actually more likely the second book written. So the Gospel of Matthew, we don't know who wrote it. The author is unknown. He never self-identifies in the Gospel. Tradition has always claimed that it was written by Matthew, who was one of the disciples of Jesus. He was a tax collector that was specifically called, possibly because of some of his knowledge around money and the references to money in the Gospel of Matthew. However, there's no real evidence really to support it other than some of the tradition, and historians and scholars think that it's probably really unlikely that Matthew wrote it, partly because of the timing of when it's written. Most of the original disciples would be kind of passing on, as well as the fact that some of what's written would not have been at the educational level of a tax collector. So his background in education wouldn't have made him a likely candidate to write the gospel, though it is possible that he inspired some of its writing, or that he was one of the kind of the sourcing parts of this gospel. So who is he writing to? Well, he's writing to the early church community, so early Christians. What's interesting is the Gospel of Matthew is the only gospel that makes reference to the church, so that's why that's in quotes there. He gives it that title and that name, but he's actually really talking to a primarily Jewish community, a community that's really grounded in its Jewish faith and is looking or trying to kind of reconcile its relationship with Jesus, and if Jesus fits kind of their understanding of faith and who God is and what their call is. And so Matthew will really hone in on how Jesus ties to Judaism and how he kind of fits that model. It also seems to be maybe a more urban setting that the Gospel of Matthew is written in. He'll refer to the polis, or the city, much more frequently than his counterparts of the Synoptic Gospels, as well as to coinage, like gold and silver. So it seems that he's in a more urban environment. Also, it's important to note that this is being written after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which happened in 70 CE or 70 AD. So the temple is destroyed, Jerusalem has been sacked, and you can kind of see that dynamic being kind of referenced in the Gospel of Matthew, so it's clear that it's being written afterwards. It's also important to note that at this time, historically, the Jews that are remaining Jewish and the Christians are not getting along. In fact, there are Jews out persecuting and bringing Christians to trial. As we get into the Acts of the Apostles, you'll see this with a dude named Paul. He is a pretty strong advocate going out and bringing Christians to trial. So there's tension between the two groups, which Matthew is going to try to kind of reconcile, if at all possible. Now I want you to just take a minute in your notes to think about, if you need to, take a moment to discuss with your neighbor, but then I want you to just write down real briefly, how do you think this community is feeling and what might they need from Jesus? Right? We know that Jesus' goal is to be relatable, and the Gospels try to help make and clarify how Jesus does relate to their audiences. So I want you to just take a second, jot down some ideas. How would this Jesus be relatable to this audience? What might the author Matthew need to be focusing or emphasizing about Jesus' ministry for this community? So, some key characteristics of the Gospel of Matthew. First, Jesus, again, right, he's writing to a primarily Jewish community. Jesus is going to be portrayed in traditional Jewish roles. He's going to show how Jesus fulfills the messianic hope that we read about in the prophets. He's He's going to try to show how he is the Messiah, the fulfillment of those covenants. He's going to portray him as a prophet, oftentimes juxtaposing him to Moses. So there'll be lots of references to Moses or allusions to things like Moses, like fleeing from Egypt, or fleeing to Egypt in this case, the massacre of babies, Jesus goes up on mountains quite often, like Moses goes up on mountains. He'll also really emphasize Jesus as a teacher, as a rabbi, because that was a role of importance and value in the Jewish community. Like I said, Matthew will show how Jesus is fulfilling promises from the Old Testament. There'll be lots of times when in the Gospel of Matthew he'll say, as said by Isaiah, or as said by a different prophet, and then we'll show how Jesus fulfills a promise given by God to the people through the prophets. He also will show how Jesus will bring a new law to this new church community. But Jesus doesn't abolish the Jewish law, but comes and kind of brings it new life, and sometimes pushes it a little harder and a little deeper, which you'll get a chance to kind of see a little more in depth later in this lesson. So all of the Gospels have symbols, and the Gospel of Matthew shows Jesus, or is shown as a winged human, not an angel. I know it looks like an angel, sounds like an angel, smells like an angel, so it must be an angel. It's not. It's a winged human. It's supposed to emphasize that Matthew is focusing on Jesus's Jewish nature, which is a big part of his humanity and kind of his genealogy. It's part of becoming a man, is taking up that genealogy. Speaking of Jesus's genealogy, some fun facts about it. First, to tie in that super Jewish nature and to show how Jesus fulfills things, in the genealogy found in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus will clearly be tied, I think it's 14 generations back to David, and then 14 from there up to Abraham. There might have been another set of 14 in there as well. But Jesus, the genealogy goes Abraham down and shows how it hit David and how it heads down to Jesus. So that Jesus is tied to these two very important Jewish figures of the family. Also, fun fact in the genealogy are people like Ruth, woohoo, and Rahab, if you remember them from some of our Old Testament units. All right, so the Gospel of Matthew, if I had to sum up the Gospel of Matthew in one word, it is teaching. The Gospel of Matthew is showing Jesus as a teacher, as a rabbi. Matthew has tons and tons of Jesus's teaching. In fact, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus gives 5 big speeches or collections of teachings. So there's 5 different discourses that Jesus gives in the Gospel of Matthew. And it's supposed to make us think not only of Jesus as a teacher, but it should kind of remind us of the 5 books of the Torah given to us by Moses, because Jesus is kind of the new Moses in the Gospel of Matthew. So you'll see lots of parallels between those two. I want you to take a second and think and reflect in your notes, because, of course, we all have, as students, as kids in school, we all have experiences of teachers. So I want you to think just for a few minutes in your notes about who are some teachers who really impacted you positively. What did you learn from him, her, or them? Just take a minute or two in your notes to think about those awesome teachers that you've experienced. Maybe think of ways that you could let them know how great they are. All right, to help us get a little more in touch with Matthew, and what I want you to do is you're going to get a handout from our substitute at this point, and then you're going to pick one of these 4 readings from the Gospel of Matthew, one of these 4 teachings of Jesus, the teacher, to read and reflect on. Follow the directions on the screen and on your handout. You're going to be doing this quietly by yourself, just a chance to connect with the gospel and the teachings and think I will also be having these handouts collected at the end of class.